A little bit about your area of expertise.
I hold a PhD in psychology. My main research interests focus on gender diversity in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, and also transitions into and out of those fields.
If you could tell me a little bit about what you and your colleagues were looking to find out.
We were interested in how children's depictions of scientists have changed over time. In a classic study conducted in the 1960s and 1970s, nearly 5,000 children were asked to draw a scientist. Of those 5,000 drawings, only 28 of them depicted a female scientist. And so suggesting that children were strongly associating science with men. And those findings were very striking to me, especially because such a limited view of who scientists are might potentially limit girls' interest in science. And so we wanted to know, how has that changed over time? A lot has changed since the 1960s and 1970s. Women's representation in science has substantially risen since then, and also there's some evidence to suggest that female scientists are now more often portrayed in children's media. So, for instance, there was a study that found that women and girls were approximately 13% of images of people in science feature stories for the magazine Highlights for Children back in the 1960s. However, that percentage rose to 44% in the 2000s. And so we wanted to know, given this increase in women participating in science and increase of showing female scientists in children's media, we wanted to know, how have children's own beliefs about who does science, how have those beliefs changed over time?
How did you go about taking a look at that?
There was a wealth of studies that have used this draw a scientist task. It's pretty simple. Simply ask children to draw a scientist, give them 15-20 minutes to do so. And then from what you get back, you can tell the gender of the scientist often, not always, but often based on cues such as hair length and the attire that they're wearing. And this simple task has been used for 5 decades now, in part, I think, because of its simplicity, that a teacher that maybe isn't trained as a researcher can ask their children to draw this and then share those drawings with researchers. And so what we did was a comprehensive literature search for all of the studies that we could find that have asked US children from grades kindergarten through 12th grade, all those studies that have asked those children to draw a scientist. And so we filtered 17 literature databases, filtered over 3,000 references, and in the end found 78 studies containing over 20,000 children over a span of 5 decades.
What did you do with that massive amount of information and 78 studies?
One of the core findings that we found once we analyzed all of this data is that US children now draw female scientists more often than ever before. So, in the original landmark study conducted in the 1960s and 1970s, less than 1% of children drew a female scientist. In contrast, in the 1980s and onwards, 28% of children on average drew female scientists. And even within that later time period, from the 1980s and onwards, there's some evidence of change, though the findings were tentative. But currently, on average, about 34% of children in the most recent year of data that we had, which was 2016, 34% of children drew a female scientist.
You said the most recent data was from 2016. What do these findings suggest?
They suggest that children's stereotypes associating science with men have weakened during this time period, which encouragingly suggests that girls may now develop interest in science more freely than they once did than compared to decades ago. At the same time, however, there were findings regarding age that would be of concern, potential concern, to parents and teachers. So we found that, so we are also interested in the development of these stereotypes. How do they change as children advance from elementary school to middle school to high school? And what we found is that when children entered school in kindergarten, around ages 5 to 6, they drew roughly equal proportions of female and male scientists, suggesting that at that early age, they hadn't yet learned to associate science with men. However, the tendency to depict male scientists strongly increased with age, such that at ages 5 to 6, girls actually drew more female scientists than male scientists. But around the ages of 10 to 11, they flipped from drawing to then drawing more male than female scientists, such that by the time that they got to high school, they were drawing roughly 3/4 male scientists. So my findings do indicate that there is optimism for these stereotypes to change over time as women's representation in science has changed and increased. At the same time, however, children are still learning to associate science with men as they age.
What are the implications? Are there ages for earlier intervention or discussion with boys and girls about STEM and gender?
I think that teachers and parents should be aware that elementary school is a critical period in which students start to associate science with men. They don't come into elementary school having already formed those associations, but during those ages from 5 to 10, that's really when they start to develop those associations. And so I think it's critical that students see examples of scientists that go beyond the typical old, dead, white male scientists that might be typically presented in classrooms. I think it's critical that students see that scientists of all races and genders and sexual orientation and gender identity participate in science. Yes, there are disparities currently in representation in these fields. At the same time, however, there are many examples to draw from of diverse scientists working in these fields.
Why is it important that kids have this more well-rounded view of what a scientist is?
I think it's important in terms of their own, children's own identities and self-concepts. You know, certainly not all children are going to become interested in science. They have lots of other passions and interests, but I think it's important for children that might have, interests and aptitudes in these fields to not limit themselves based on societal views of who can pursue those fields. So the basic point is that children should be able to have examples of scientists where they could imagine themselves as, the role models that they see could be possible future selves of these children, so that if they are interested, that they aren't limited by those stereotypes.
For parents, what are some of the tips that you might be able to suggest, ways that they can encourage their kids to think more about women in the sciences and not develop those science stereotypes?
One answer is that there isn't a whole lot of research on solid empirical interventions for how to change these stereotypes. So I want to put that point of caution. Yet at the same time, there is other related work that suggests potential things that parents can do. An example is to take children to museums and make sure that children can see different examples of scientists there. Now, sort of as a two-edged sword, right? What if they go to science museums and still it only shows old dead white scientists? Then perhaps that's counter. But I think in terms of the exemplars, the important implication is seeing scientists that children might be able to identify. And actually elaborating a little bit more on this point is, in some cases, it's important for those role models that it's not just the gender of the role model that matters. It also matters whether they embody sort of stereotypical notions of what scientists and computer scientists are. So for instance, there was a study that found when girls interacted with a stereotypical computer scientist, so like wearing Star Trek t-shirts or kind of nerdy, asocial, that actually decreased interest in computer science compared to seeing non-stereotypical examples. But obviously there are, people that love Star Trek and, might, be similar to the sort of stereotypical representations. But again, the point goes back to children being exposed to a wide array of potential scientists that they might be able to identify with.
Popular media, a good place to start now that in some examples women are more equally represented?
We have seen changes in media over time as well. So for instance, I'm thinking of in Black Panther, there was a great example of a female black scientist there. I think media does have a potentially powerful effect on children. And that is one hypothesis for the changes over time that we saw. We can't make any direct causal link given the limited correlational data. But like I mentioned, there was an analysis that looked at the magazine highlights for children that found changes over time in women's representation in terms of who was portrayed. But then there's a lot of other forms of media, such as television, that is likely important. At the same time, our scientific empirical understanding of those mass media effects is still under development.
You had sent a couple of pictures, examples of artwork that children have drawn over the years. Can you just describe what kind of things you saw when you looked at all of those faces?
If you look at the actual content of these drawings, some of the common things represented in them might be lab coats and eyeglasses and laboratory equipment. And for some of these studies, they also reported data on that additional information as well. And so where it was available, we looked at that. And one interesting finding is that as children aged, the proportion of drawings with lab coats and eyeglasses also increased with age, suggesting that children learn multiple stereotypes about scientists, not just related to the gender of them. The indication of laboratory coats and eyeglasses might mean that children think of scientists as nerdy, but again, I'm limited in terms of what data were actually available. Yeah.
Was there anything else that I didn't ask you that you want to make sure that our viewers know?
One additional finding was regards to differences between girls and boys' drawings. So overall, girls were much more likely to draw female scientists than boys, which makes sense given other research where if you ask children to simply draw a person, children are far more likely to draw their own sex. So in other words, these drawings partly represent aspects of children's own gender identity. At the same time, what's important to note is that the changes that we found over time and across age were found for both girls and boys. So, meaning, for instance, that both girls and boys drew more female scientists over time, even though girls overall, on average, drew female scientists more than boys.
Just a little bit about your background. If you could tell me where you got your undergraduate degree, master's degree, advanced degrees.
My background was actually originally in physics. That's what I earned my bachelor's degree in. And as I was studying physics, I was always really interested in how students learn science and the processes by which they identify as scientists. And so after I earned my bachelor's in physics, I pursued science education research at UC Berkeley, and then moved into the PhD program in psychology at Northwestern, which I recently just graduated from back in June. And so my PhD was in psychology, and I was interested, and my broad research interests focus around gender diversity in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, as well as transitions into and out of those fields. And now I work as a researcher at American Institutes for Research, focusing in on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education.